Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Welcome. Our mission is to nurture the mind and the spirit and serve social justice. For more information about our forums, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Our forums occur most Sundays at noon. They're free and open to the public. And our church is located at 4700 Grover Avenue. And now Richard Halpin, one of our forum committee members, is going to introduce today's speaker. Richard?
Thank you, Bonnie. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are delighted to have today a remarkable Austinite who's going to speak to us about the prospect for democracy in the United States. Who better to talk about democracy than somebody who's worked for decades getting grassroots people elected to the democracy? And by way of introduction, our speaker today, David Butts, is a veteran political consultant and campaign manager. According to the Austin American Statesman, David has helped elect at least 3 mayoral candidates and 12 city council members in the last 15 years. Is that right, David? Something like that. He's also advised congressional and gubernatorial candidates. So I thought, what better lead into democracy than a little reading from the Tao Te Ching? I have just 3 things to teach: simplicity, patience, compassion. These 3 are your greatest treasures. Simple in actions and in thoughts, you return to the source of being. How could you possibly get anybody elected if you weren't simple about it? Patient with both friends and enemies, you accord with the way things are. Compassionate toward yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world. So for anybody to have the kind of smile David has on his face, he must have been able to reconcile with a lot of different folks. Please give a warm and wonderful welcome to our guest today, David Butts.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank Richard and Bonnie and the Unitarian Forum. Also, I want to thank Richard Cohane, Jim Cohane, because he had asked me several years ago to come and speak, and I basically said, I don't think I have anything to say. Hopefully, I am a little more enlightened at this stage. And so my first experience in coming in contact with the Unitarians was sitting at the age of 10 between my mother and my aunt from Mississippi. They were talking. I was still rather small even then. And they were talking, and my aunt, in a very whispery voice, said, "My brother is a Unitarian, and they don't believe in Jesus." My ears perked up immediately, like, what? What is this? I mean, who are these people, kind of a thing. Not so much in anger or fear, but curiosity. So that was my first exposure to Unitarians. I've spent about 5 decades working in politics at varying levels, from the lowest grunt up to being a campaign manager. I've never run for high political office. And as Socrates once said, it's the duty of every virtuous man to not seek higher public office. To which John F. Kennedy, when he was defeated for the vice presidency in 1956 by the senator from Tennessee, when Adlai Stevenson drew the convention open to the floor to allow them to pick the vice presidential nominee to run with him, and they questioned Kennedy in Boston, how did you lose to that raccoon cap wearing senator from Tennessee? He replied saying just what I said about Socrates, and then added, yes, and the people recognized my virtue before I did. So, I got interested in politics because I recognized at an early age that there was something not quite right in our country. Now, I don't purport to have known what it was exactly, but I knew there were some serious problems. I could tell. And John F. Kennedy inspired me to get active in politics. And so I remained active from that point forward. I did not intend to become a political consultant. I intended to teach history. And so primarily I'm going to talk about history. And the thing to note about historians, of which I don't claim to be one by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not an academician by any sense of the word. More of the school of hard knocks, I suppose, is that historians are seldom get passing notice until they're dead, but only if they've drank hemlock in the process. And they're sort of like dead Democratic presidents that Republicans revere. They only revere them while they're when they're dead, never when they're alive. So basically, that's the fate of historians. As you all heard that saw, that historians are people teaching us history so we will not repeat our mistakes. My observation is that is exactly the opposite. We're teaching history so we can repeat those mistakes and repeat them and repeat them. And maybe that has something to do with our DNA, possibly, as much as any other factor. So I want to lay out to you the first and the most powerful political message that I ever encountered. The single most potent, and it's something that every one of you have felt. I'm sure of it. And I felt it. But when it was presented to me in such a stark way, it was like a revelation. Like it was all new. I was driving down Airport Boulevard in the 90s. I can't remember exactly. Probably in the mid-90s. And on the left side of the Airport Boulevard, I was going north towards 290. I look up and there is a whitewashed billboard. A very large billboard, whitewashed. And someone had scrambled up the rigging there to use a can of black spray paint to put this simple message on it. It said, "You are the product." To me, that is the most powerful message I have ever encountered. And it reminded me exactly of what we're dealing with in this country, in this world, in our existence, particularly under the system of economics that we operate under. I thought about, sort of telling you a whole series of political anecdotes, ones that I'd experienced, ones that people had told me, and ones that I'd heard about, as sort of leading you to the promised land or whatever, and and do it that way, and try to be sort of Jon Stewart and give you a few chuckles, and maybe I've given you a few already, or run the risk of sounding like some sort of revivalist preacher. Spitting hellfire and apocalypse, that the world's coming to an end and we're about to see, the tribulations and all that kind of stuff. I did see driving yesterday, taking my wife and I, my wife is Sue Wiederspan right there. We were driving a very large possum that had showed up in our backyard over to wildlife rescue, which I do quite frequently. I'm a big advocate for animals. And as we were driving over there, I noticed a church that had a big headline that said, "Revelations Explained." I thought maybe I should go there today and see what Revelations tells us. But anyway, that's sort of the milieu, if you want to use that French word, that we seem to be swimming in these days, at least in the United States, but all across the world for that matter. Several days ago, our illustrious United States Senator, Ted Cruz, was speaking in New Hampshire. And he said, let me look at my notes here. He said, "The world is on fire. Your world is on fire." Those were his precise words. Well, he should know, since he's one of the arsonists that's involved in it. Basically. While he was speaking of what he says are the disasters in the United States, he was not encompassing the entire world, just the United States problems, that we were slipping off the slippery slope of debacle. Primarily, what he was concerned about was Obama and anything Obama has ever thought about, apparently. I would say that there is some truth, but only in a broader context. Ultranationalism is on the rise across the world, and combined in some instances is religious zealotry. A very volatile mix. We see it all across the world. We see it in the Muslim world, in portions of the Muslim world. We see it in Russia. We see it in Europe, where there's a growing anger and resentment by the native people at those who have moved in to their countries, Germany, Italy, France, mainly Muslim, to some extent the result of having empire, France and England in particular. But those fires are burning across the world. We can talk about the Middle East, the East, China in particular, which seems to be more about economics, but maybe there's more there than I realize. But that is happening, and it's happening in the United States. And we see the rise of nationalist instincts that are blind to science and reason. And those are very potent and dangerous forces that are being unleashed. The 21st century could be said to have started with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The new world that we now know seems to hinge on that point. Prior to that, there had been this sort of paralysis or head between us and the communist. The disillusion of the only seriously competing economic system, communism, left capitalism triumphant on the field. There was a joke in the Soviet Union at the time, or they had many jokes about their system. There was a debate in the Soviet Union over whether communism was scientific or it was created by politicians. The majority of Russian people were convinced it had to be politicians because if it had been scientific, they would have tested on rats first. That's their joke. In his only book that I'm aware of, a neoconservative think tanker declared it was the end of history. That was a rather short-lived experience, I might add. You can now pick his book up at half-price book for less than half price. Now, with that disillusion, where two opposing blocks sort of force people to, put aside some of their divisions and some of their differences internally to meet the common enemy, as it were, however you see that. Now that that has been removed, these forces of nationalism and religious zealotry no longer have those sort of brakes put down upon them. We saw what happened with Yugoslavia when Tito died, and the disintegration and the basic ethnic cleansing and mass genocide that went on in Yugoslavia between the different groups who'd been killing each other for about 700 years over religion and territory and all the other things that people kill each other over. Of course, we have only to look at Iraq, where our illustrious previous president boldly went into to create a new world order. If he had talked to any historians, they would have told him what we see today, which is three nations being born in blood and conflict, would result, because they've been killing each other for a long time, about maybe 900 years. Some of it over which one is the descendant of Muhammad, but needless to say, they're still the feelings are very intense as we witness. And so, those forces have been released. The United States, which has become an empire, we are an empire. There's no question about that. Maybe not in the classic Roman sense that we go out and seize territory and hold it, but economically, our reach is considerable today. China is pushing up against us, to be sure. And you don't see them sending troops to the Middle East or doing anything. They're basically investing their money in their economic future as they see it. The problem with empire is that many historians have asserted that empire is incompatible with democracy for all the reasons, because if no other reason, necessity triumphs law. Necessity triumphs law, which is an adage from Machiavelli. That when it comes time to do something that must be done, regardless of the legal ramifications or the impact, it must be done. Pericles said to the Athenians that empire, once embraced, is a dangerous thing to let go of. And we're finding that out. We have over 100 military bases around the world. And in that process, we have built an incredible military-industrial complex that penetrates every portion of the country and beyond. We're tied into Europe and to other parts of the world also. That military-industrial complex is able to wield incredible economic and political power within the United States. And I don't mean to suggest that they're uniform in their opinions or that they don't have disagreements internally. They do, but they also have a common goal. They always need an enemy to justify their existence and their expansion. And now we're talking again about expanding the military, which can be argued that it's a good idea or it's a bad idea, given the context of the time we're in. But I'm reminded, and I have studied this a lot, what Dwight Eisenhower had to say about the military-industrial complex. In his farewell address to the nation on January 17, 1961, I'll read the precise words. He did support a military, obviously. He had been a general, and he knew the importance, and they were faced with a serious threat from the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had said, "We will bury you." I suppose one way or the other. But he said, "A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our aims must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. But then, the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, and even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house." Now, he's saying this in 1961. "Every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend the grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." He also went on to make an environmental statement in that speech, which is never referenced. But what the military-industrial complex is real. And this, I wonder what General Eisenhower would think about the fact that we presently have, that we know of anyway, 17 different agencies, or portions of agencies, that are dedicated to collecting data. Collecting data worldwide, collecting data internally within the United States, phone calls, filing away emails that are sent out into the ether. You may have a whole, it's possible you may have a whole section devoted to yourself. And everything you put out there is being listed. Sometime in the future, they may come to your door and say, "You said, we should do something about that idiot, Ted Cruz." What did you mean by that? But anyway, hopefully, I think Eisenhower would be a little frightened at what he saw. I think he was not someone who loved, war. He did not, from everything I've read about him. By the way, when Eisenhower was having this speech put together, he referred to it as the business military complex. and his aides threw a total fit and said, "Mr. President, you're a Republican. How can you use business, the word business, in that kind of pejorative way? We can't be saying that. You've got to take that word out." And so, military-industrial complex. That's how the industrial got in there. But originally it was business. So the first thing I said to you is that you are the product. The second thing is that there's a disillusion of the old order. And that disillusion is reflected in what we see worldwide and here in the United States. The breakdown of civility, political civility, the widening diversion economically within the country between the haves and the have-nots, all of which we've heard over and over again, been hearing about for 40 or 50, 60, 100 years, and the basic attitude of hostility towards government, which is both justified and unjustified, depending on how you look at it. Populism, of which we're seeing quite a dose of these days in the United States, is neither inherently left or right. It can be both simultaneously. There is an instinct within this country that has always been critical of government. It started with our revolution against the British, or maybe even before that. Part of that revolution was driven by the fact the British said to a lot of the settlers, "You can't go further west than this because you'll be encroaching on the Indian lands, and we don't want a war." They didn't like that. But the thing to remember about any formation of government is that in spite, and this is what I believed for so long, that the government was there to promote my welfare. And yes, it should. It says in the Constitution, basically that most governments actually promote the welfare of money and protect money and take care of money first and foremost. Our founding fathers basically wrote a document. They had many good qualities to it. But when the subtext was a deep concern that the masses would get out of control, that they would resort to, violence, or resort to not paying their debts, or resort to. And so the franchise, although it was done state by state, as it's prescribed in the Constitution, the franchise was basically very limited, as you know. And so our Constitution and our government, basically, its primary purpose was to promote, the expansion of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, Louisiana Purchase, to promote the trade and protect those who had wealth at the expense of those who did not. And to make sure that those people who did not get too uppity, shall we say. And there's instances of that throughout the early history of the United States and how the government reacted to those kinds of things. Right, justified or unjustified. But do not operate under the illusion that the government, any government, unless you have a real say about it, that government is there automatically to promote and protect your interests. Sure, collectively, we want to protect our interests, all of us, against an attack from a foreign power. Who wouldn't? At the same time, though, when it comes to internal decisions, those decisions are basically made about where the wealth is and what the wealth needs. And I believe that devoutly. I have no doubt of it. And it is true of all governments. The Roman government, Rome, was nothing but basically set up to promote the wealthiest interest. Marcus Crassus, who's the man who destroyed Spartacus, he was estimated to be worth, by today's dollars, $8.5 billion. He funded single-handedly the army that went out and destroyed Spartacus and his army, more or less. Not everybody, but most of them. And the Roman, most of the people who worked the land were thrown off the land at some point and replaced by slaves. So, whether it's Greece or Rome or France or England or any, Russia or any country you look at, with few exceptions, and only for brief periods of time probably, you will see that basically government has protected the interest of the aristocracy, of which we have always had a group of people in this country who wish to be aristocrats. Whether they'll call it that or not is another matter. They are, and they think of themselves as an elite. They may not like each other. They may have competitive, economic interest, but more or less. Now, this is not to say that all rich people are evil and all poor people are good, because they're not. I've seen a lot of good people who had money and used it wisely in many different ways, and poor people who were mean as snakes. So basically, it's human. But in the total sum of things, that's what our government does. So what I think has happened is that we have a situation where our democracy, as best we can define it, is in dissolution to the extent that it's ever been a democracy. We call it a Republican democracy. It's not a pure democracy. And it's one of the reasons the Founding Fathers wanted it that way. Remember, the U.S. Senate was appointed by the state legislatures. It was not elected directly by the people. So, until 1916. Basically, democracy is capable of producing a Hitler as easily as it can produce an Obama, depending on the psychic nature of the time, of the nation, the people that are involved, what they're going through. No one would have thought Germany, the center of culture, really, although the French would deny that, of course. The center of culture, in at least Central Europe, that a Hitler could rise to power. Paul Johnson, a conservative historian, not yet dead, titled his chapter on Germany after World War I, at the end of World War I, Waiting for Hitler. That was the title of the chapter. And basically, the book is Modern Times, in case you're interested. It gives you a good synopsis of his take on what's going on in Europe right after World War I has ended, leading to the next one. So, yes, democracy can produce tyrants, and has. Juan Perón in Argentina, as an example. Not to say that the alternative was any better, necessarily. People would say, well, the United States has this long democratic tradition. Unlike Germany, which had a Kaiser, and only grudgingly a parliament that basically had very little to say about what the government did, only after the war were they given any power, which meant, of course, they got all the blame for what happened, which was a clever ploy on the part of the militarist in Germany to hand it over to the civilians, the socialists, the center Democrats, and let them struggle with an impossible situation, which, of course, led catastrophically to an end with the economic decline that occurred in 1929, which really sent everybody spilling out. So, what is happening in the United States? What do I think is happening in the United States? Well, I think that a green wall of money has descended across the United States from the the chief financial center of the universe, Wall Street, across the United States to state capital after state capital, engineered by wealthy men and women, for that matter, but primarily men, buying our government. Now, we've always had a certain degree of bought government. But with the recent rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court, the McCutcheon versus FEC and United Citizen versus FEC, basically the floodgates are seriously down. What remains to be seen is whether or not the Supreme Court will eventually broach or breach the subject of individual contributions. Whether individuals who are limited in federal level to $2,600 at this point to a congressional candidate, whether or not I can claim, or the Supreme Court will rule by a 5-4 decision, that that's an infringement upon my First Amendment rights to be able to give unlimited personal campaign contributions to any candidate that I choose to do so. McCutcheon simply allows you to give more money, both to the political committee and to a larger number of candidates, a broader amount of money. This is the most recent ruling. It was in April of 2014. Those 5 members of the Supreme Court basically believe that free speech and money are tied together, which I would suggest we should probably change the First Amendment to read you're entitled to all the free speech that you have money to buy, which is what we're talking about here. And that somehow that in no way will have any kind of corrupting influence upon our democracy. So what has happened? Well, to use the Romans, vox pecunia, vox Dei. The voice of money is the voice of God in the United States and across the world, for that matter. I mean, Putin is reportedly sitting on about $40 billion himself, so probably he won't blow up the world. Let's hope. So what I see is this wall that has developed around Washington, around most of the state capitals, funded by very wealthy, reactionary interests that are fully intent on having their way with our government. So let me make sure I've hit all the high points here. What has happened here in the United States, and I'll be very brief about this now, is that what has led to this sort of populist ferment. We've always had populism, and there's always a level of anti-intellectualism and anti-science in American history. The rejection of the experts, rejection of government, rejection of anyone being able to tell me what I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it. You know, sort of the Marlboro man meets the Southern plantation owner. What is driven? One is that jobs, the lack thereof, and income insecurity for a broad cross-section of the population. There are millions of people who were wiped out in the 2008 stock market crash, and they're never going to recover. They're done. They're already drawing their Social Security at the age of 62, many of them. We have a clash between traditional culture and modernity that is a constant throughout our history and throughout all histories. But in the United States, because we have such a polyglot, non-uniform kind of culture, there's opportunities for lots of clashes. So finally, let me say what I think are the things that we have to do. Easy for me to say. First, we must become more militant. We must be prepared to boycott, protest, put a public black eye on interest in individuals who are ruthless and intent on basically subverting the democratic process in this country. That's going to be required. Simply rolling over and letting them just, milk you. You are the product, you understand, is the other option. A lot of people won't go along with this. As Jay Gould said when he was told that his actions would lead to crops being burned in the fields, strikes, riots in the cities. Jay Gould was the John D. Rockefeller of trains. He said, it doesn't matter. I can hire half the working class to kill the other half. And I think in Texas you can hire 2/3 of them at sub-minimum wage. We must democratize the corporate boards. And by that I mean there must be labor, environmentalists, consumers serving on the board. If we're going to have corporations who are now these super citizens, they are super citizens. They have far more rights than you do. There must be a democratization of those boards, or we will pay the price for that. And finally, we must reduce the impact of money. The struggle is the education process for the masses. The struggle. You read our history, you know that most of the great struggles that resulted in moving things forward started off with disasters. People were killed. Strikes were broken. People were beaten down, starved. Phelps Dodge loaded up 5,000 striking workers and their families in train cars and dropped them off in the middle of the desert from a copper mine that they were striking. Just dropped them off. No water, no food. In the Mojave Desert, as an example. That was some time ago. It wasn't recent. But don't think it can't happen again. You have to stand up and push back against this. You have to be more militant and aggressive against that kind of reactionaryism. Otherwise, they're going to continue to chip away and control and basically make a world of their own making, which may or may not include you. So, I'm ready for questions.
Thank you, David. Okay. Raise your hands high so we can see you.
Okay, I would just like to have one question about nomenclature here, and I have made it before. Populism in American history refers to the People's Party of the late 19th century. What happened to using the word demagoguery for what you were calling populism and restrict populists to a very honored tradition in American politics?
Okay. Well, as with all things, the establishment either is very good at co-opting the word or the idea, or they basically denigrate it and blast it apart. In the South, when the populist movement was on the rise at the turn of the century, the Bourbon Democrats, which term basically for the aristocrats of the South, raised the whole issue of race as a way to split the working white voter. I mean, all men, because at that time women couldn't even vote, basically. And so they've always found ways to drive wedges between the groups of people who should be together. But race, clearly in the South, was an example of that. In the Midwest, it was the idea that they were socialist, or that they were somehow un-American, or that they were somehow going to undermine our free system, that kind of thing. And so it was a constant battle. The nature of third parties is always to become submerged into one of the two existing parties, if not both. That's been our history. And part of that's because the parties realize here's a constituency we need to reach out to, and they do. If they're wise, they choose to do so. The Democrats did to the populist movement on silver coinage. William Jennings Bryan, who said, you cannot crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. I mean, basically, that ferment is always there. Populism is not inherently demagogic, but it depends on the personality. I mean, George Wallace would be called a populist. Well, because he also talked about economic issues and about the middle class being screwed over by the system. He didn't like the bankers. He was also a racist, or acted as a racist. So there's always this complexity of approaches depending on the region you're from, that kind of a thing.
Thank you very much. If you compare the European Union's safety net their educational system that's free. If I have a friend moving from Finland to Berlin, he's still going to go to the university free. The absence of those things that seem to be here that create anxiety. For example, people who are afraid to leave their job because they'll lose their health care. And the other anxieties that are manifest by the high use of drugs in this country, both prescription and non-prescription drugs. How does our society, how can we flourish in the future when those items continue to seem to be working against us in this country for having a stable, productive, and well-educated society?
Well, out of crisis comes opportunity. And the times that we've advanced in this country have been primarily during times of crisis or great affluence, like the 50s and mid-60s. We had the right president, our presidents in place at that moment, with John Kennedy. Maybe Kennedy's assassination actually led to much of what happened under Johnson, in the sense that people felt like, we need to do this, This is what he wanted. Just sort of that whole movement. Generally, the forces, reactionary forces, oppose these things because they know it costs money. It takes money away from them, or it puts restrictions on what they can do or how they treat their employees. And so they're basically going to fight this, and they're well entrenched. You know that. To me, it probably only happens through resistance and through crisis, of which I suspect, one way or the other, we'll be seeing soon enough. Someone writes about the climate change, and he titled it, I thought very appropriately, The Long Emergency. Well, I see that more and more as I look around the world and see what's going on, the kind of storms and the kinds of flooding and the kinds of, all those things that are occurring. Those are going to lead to great displacements, economic displacements as well as territorial displacements. They're going to lead to tension and strife, droughts when nations don't have water. What are they going to do? So I think that all I can say about that is, since I can't wave a magic wand, if I could wave a magic wand, we'd all be riding horses right now. We'd all be happy. Of course, it'd be my sense of what's happy, which someone would say, wait a minute.
While it's not over yet, how would you evaluate the Obama presidency?
A good person, intelligent, not the most effective, not able to... I think he made the wrong choice, is what I want to say, at the beginning of his administration. He should have focused on the economy. People were hurting. And the stimulus was not big enough. And basically, he needed to get his total focus on that and get the public behind him. And with success with that, then health care would be an easier boulder to move. Now the Republicans are always there waiting, to reemerge, and they never intended to allow him to have any success for fear that it might mean they would be sent off to, some far netherworld that would never, they would never come back from. I tend to feel that his presidency has been stable, but not as productive as it should have been, is my feeling. I don't know if that's just my feeling now, but looking at it, the economy's better, and I give him credit for that, but it took an awful long time, and we had to basically lose control of Congress in 2010. And then sort of the ennui and all the sins of the first term always come down on you in the second midterm election. So now we have an even more entrenched reactionary force. Not that all the Democrats are that good either, by any stretch of the imagination.
We mentioned a moment ago some of the European countries. Now I'm wondering, here in the U.S., it's been frequently criticized that we are fated to have two and only two parties, and the rise of different ideas, different parties, is prevented from that. They almost approach each other. Whereas in the parliamentary form of government, there's a greater chance for change and opposition. Is there a way we can get out of this trap?
Well, if you could get 38 states to agree to changes to a parliamentary system, I tend to think that the powers that be know they got a pretty good deal going, and they're not going to let go of it. Absolutely, if we had a parliament, there'd be a rise of third parties that would form coalitions with the major parties, as it were, just as we saw in Israel as an example, speaking of ultranationalism, that will lead to no good end, in my personal opinion, in the long run. And I say that with great regret. But what has generally happened, as I said before, is that whenever a third-party movement rises and has a powerful idea, one of the two parties moves towards it and tries to absorb it into it. And, without the formal structure, Ross Perot had billions of dollars, but it was all about him, of course. It was just Ross Perot. That's the party, the Reform Party. It takes more than that to build a political party. Clearly, if we had a parliamentary system, you're right, we would have third parties. But our system, if the system continues to prove that it's gridlocked and cannot move anything forward, there will be a splintering, but probably only temporarily. You may have noticed Glenn Beck just announced he's not a Republican anymore. Whatever that means, he's off the edge of the earth somewhere, I suppose.
Thank you for sharing your perspective with us today. In your concluding remarks, if I understood correctly, you said to challenge corporate power, which can be often not in our best interest, that we need to push back. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, maybe give us some examples of how we can push back. Mm-hmm. Are there any individuals or organizations or movements today that are effectively pushing back? Thanks.
I would say outside of the group that's trying to fight Citizen United, which you may be aware of, they're making some effort. I wouldn't say that it's a very stirring effort, in the sense that it's mobilizing the masses. Campaign finance reform has always had sort of a weak appeal to a lot of voters, partly because they don't support public funding of campaigns. So how are you going to fund campaigns? Plus, they also believe that all candidates take money from nefarious sources. If you ask them about it, that's their belief. And there's some truth to that, although not complete truth. As far as a movement to try to take on corporate power, there have been sort of, very like little fires, but they basically sputtered out. I suggest that you start one right now. Power to the people. So, basically, at some point, as I said, crisis will present opportunity. Maybe we haven't reached that crisis point. There's this book out by Stephen Fraser. Some of you may have read it. The Age of Acquiescence. What's the difference between the turn of the century, the Gilded Age, in which people were basically living in pretty grinding poverty, and now, where we see this incredible upsurge of wealth and tremendous, concentration, people's retirement funds wiped out. What is the difference? Well, the difference is that a lot of people have something, and they want to hang on to it. And they're afraid if they get too far out there or disrupt the system, they might lose it, what little they have left. And there's certainly, a certain number of millionaires. I think we have millions of millionaires now in the country who all believe that, the problem we have in this country is that too many people think that there's something wrong with them because they're not millionaires, in my opinion. I'd love to be a millionaire, but I'm never going to be one. So, I'm not counting on it. I don't begrudge anyone being rich. It's just, what do you do with your money? How do you use it? And there has to be a democratization. History shows that those kinds of gaps do not last. There is some sort of upheaval that will occur because people will react. Doesn't mean the reactionary forces in control won't try to tamp it down. Anyway.
Okay, I have a question for that's sort of a follow-up question and to something that you said. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, talks about the incarcerated and recently released mostly African American males who do not fit in the society anymore. They're not able to vote, etc. And she says that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which the legal challenges has always been the preferred route to change, but she's saying that we all need to show up for demonstration, that it's mass movement, and that does count. And I think, thinking back to the 60s, there was one mass movement after another that did effect some sort of change. And so, would you talk a little bit more about that, about that mass movement and needing to, as part of pushing back?
Well, as you know, and you've all, I suspect most of you read a lot. I mean, when you read the turn of the century, people like Ida Tarbell, who wrote the expose that exposed Standard Oil and the monopoly that it was, basically caused it to be hauled before Congress. That her article, the power of that one article, basically to show the kind of monopolistic practices that the Standard Oil was operating under, and led to its breakup. So instead of one giant anaconda, it became a series of anacondas, so to speak. But it was broken up. By the way, Ida Tarbell's father had been bankrupt by Standard Oil. So she, as a young girl, she saw her father suffer through that, so she never got over that. She remembered and paid him back later. But the deal is this: we don't have to have a majority. We have to have people who are willing to put themselves out there and be critical, aggressive against what we see are the abuses of the system. The press, to the extent that it's not controlled by the corporate media like Fox, will give us some coverage. And of course, you will come under all kinds of attacks. If you did this, they will dig through everything you ever did. He didn't pay his, property taxes on time back in 1943 or something like that, and that'll be all in front of the press because they're big at discrediting people. Let me tell you, the thing that I see about the right and the left is this: the left, basically, they're great people. They're moralists. They believe in a moral society. They also have a tendency to draw a firing squad in a circle and just basically blow each other away. And that's the sad part about it. And we cannot cope with success. To win is the process. You don't do anything if you're not in control of the city government, the county government, the state government, Washington, D.C., at least democratically you don't get to do it. There are other ways of doing things, sure. But the big power, the power that can come down on you, to penetrate that. But we have a problem with that because we're suspicious of anyone who is effective. And so we also have a tendency to be a little petty, in my judgment. The right is basically vicious, very vicious, and very willing to destroy people. Now, they'll say the left does the same thing, but not by my standards, what I've seen. They also believe in a mythic America that never existed. Not really. Not the kind of mythology they steep themselves in. And so they're, very comfortable with the tradition, unless, of course, that tradition somehow threatens their economic stability, and then they're willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think that's part of what we're seeing, but it's more complex than that, and I'm not giving it justice. To answer your question, obviously we're entering a period where Jim Crow is coming back, where they're trying to basically disenfranchise black and minority voters because they see the demographic bulge that's going on. They don't call it that. It was ballot integrity and all that kind of stuff. Well, we just let this progression go on. You'll see where they're really going with this. They stole Florida with their felony program that basically identified tens of thousands of black people in Florida and pegged them as felons who were not eligible to vote when they were not those people. The election was stolen right there. Kathleen Harris and Jeb Bush. But it comes down to, there has to be sort of a spark. There has to be a spark. People have to decide that I'm tired of being a product. I'm tired of being manipulated by that. We're all manipulated in one way or the other. It's not new. But the question is of the degree and what we're willing to put up with and what we're willing to resist.
I would like you to add to, you're familiar, are you, with the Taft theory of politics? It comes from John Taft back in 44 where he wanted to be a candidate for the president run. Okay. One thing that's been, he was a conservative Republican, but one thing, he didn't say it that way, but it amounted to the Taft theory of politics is oppose, 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 no matter what the merits of the issue at hand is. That's what's going on now, more or less, is it not?
I would say so. Yeah, we have, as I said, it's blind to science and reason. And it's destructive to the country. And it's destructive to the democratic fabric of the country, such as we have. And unless the Tea Party or the types of elements that revolve around that side of it basically decide to be more constructive and cooperative with us, we're looking at basically a gradual dissolution of the democratic process in the United States. Where that will take us, I do not know. When I read, and I've read a great deal about the time prior to the Civil War, and we did not have the same issue of slavery, at least not yet. But it's very disturbing to me to see some of the parallels. And I think that there is an element out there with all this focus on guns and all this kind of stuff that is very alarming to me about where this is going to take us. It may not be immediate, but it's coming. If we do not sort of return a level of civility to our process, and that doesn't mean I get my way 100%. On either side. Anyway, thank you so much.
We have to stop, but thank you for highlighting some of the imminent perils to our democracy and for the call to action, David. Thank you.